Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind tore across the high plains outside Medicine, like it was trying to rip the past clean off the land. But Zinnia Parker stood her ground, jaw set, black skirts whipping against her legs as the coffin was lowered into the frozen dirt. Her husband, Elijah, was dead. She had nothing left, no money, no land, no kin, and the ache in her chest was hollow and wide. He had not been a cruel man, just a reckless one. Always chasing the next cattle scheme or card game, always one more debt away from making it big. He died the way he lived, fast and owing more than he owned. Zinnia's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl as the final spade of earth hit the pine box. She didn't cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. There was no space left in her for tears. The bank took their house 3 days later. The man who delivered the news avoided her eyes and cleared his throat too much. She was 30 years old and penniless with nowhere to go. The boarding house wanted rent upfront. The grocer stopped extending credit. Her last dollar went to keep her boots from falling apart. It was near dusk when she sat down on the edge of the wooden walkway outside the shuttered mercantile, pressing her hands between her knees, trying to still the shaking. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. The sky was stained red and gold behind snow-capped mountains, and the cold settled deep in her bones. A horse clopped to a stop beside her. She did not look up. "You look like you're about to fall over." The voice was warm and low, not unkind. Zinnia blinked and glanced up. The man on the horse was tall, broad across the shoulders, and dressed rough but clean. His hat shaded most of his face, but his eyes were a sharp gray-blue, and something about the way he looked at her made her feel seen. Not pitied, just noticed. "I am fine," she said flatly, his brow lifted. "You are sitting on a frozen boardwalk with no coat, and your lips are blue." "I said I am fine." He dismounted anyway, tying the reins to the post and stepping toward her. The snow crunched beneath his boots. "I am Calder Jennings," he said. "I have a small ranch about 5 miles west." "Was in town buying salt and nails." She eyed him warily. "Congratulations." His mouth twitched, but he did not smile. "You have a name, Zinnia Parker." He nodded once. "You married?" "I was. My husband died 3 weeks ago. The bank took what was left." He looked down at her for a long moment. "Come with me," she flinched. "Excuse me?" "I have a spare room. You can sleep there, eat something, get warm." He paused. "No strings. I do not take advantage of women in trouble." Zinnia stared at him. The wind bit her cheeks. Her pride screamed, but her stomach growled louder. "Why?" she asked. He shifted. "My sister died the same way, starved herself to death in Kansas City after her husband gambled everything away. I promised myself I would never ignore someone in her place if I could help it." Zinnia looked away. Her hands trembled. He said quietly, "Let me help." She nodded once. Calder helped her up gently, like she might break. He lifted her onto his horse with care, then swung up behind her, keeping his distance. They rode in silence under the stars, the prairie stretching wide and dark around them. His house was small but sturdy. Warm light spilled from the windows. He brought her inside, set a bowl of stew in front of her, and only sat once she started to eat. She did not talk. Neither did he. When she finished, he showed her the spare bedroom. It had a narrow bed, a wool blanket, and a window that looked out toward the hills. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. Zinnia looked at him. "You hardly know me." "I know enough." She hesitated. "Thank you," he nodded. "I will be up early. Coffee will be on." She closed the door behind him, then stood there for a long moment with her hand flat against the wood. The silence inside her felt different now. Not gone, but less hollow. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of boots outside. She found Calder chopping wood out back, sleeves rolled up, breath fogging in the cold. He looked up when she stepped out, and something in his face eased. "You sleep all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, thank you." He handed her a mug of coffee, still steaming. They fell into a rhythm. Zinnia helped with chores, feeding the chickens, cleaning the tack, mending shirts. Calder never hovered, never pushed. He treated her like she belonged. One afternoon, as she brushed down his horse, he leaned against the stall and watched her. "You work like someone used to it," he said. I grew up on a small farm in Arkansas before I married Elijah. He did not like when I got my hands dirty, so I stopped. Calder's brow furrowed. That is a shame, you are good at it. She met his eyes. Thank you. Days passed, snow fell. Zinnia found herself laughing once, quietly, when a rooster chased Calder across the yard. He had grinned, wide and surprised, like he had not heard laughter from her before. He started coming in earlier for supper. She started leaving the door open when she worked. Their silences became comfortable. Their glances grew longer, but she still slept in the spare room. One evening after supper, Calder leaned back in his chair and said, "You cannot live like a guest forever. People in town are already talking." Zinnia stiffened. "Let them talk." He set his tin cup down. "Or we could give them something real to talk about." She looked at him. He leaned forward, voice steady. "I have no need for a wife, but I could use a partner, someone I trust, someone who does not flinch at hard work or hard days. I can offer you my name, this house. Legal standing, safety." Zinnia's heart thudded. "And what would you get out of it?" she asked. His eyes met hers. A breath caught in her throat. "I am not asking for love," he said. "Not if you are not ready, but I will not ask you to leave, not ever." Zinnia stood slowly. Walked to the window. The moon hung low. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, then she turned. "I do not want safety, Calder. I want a home. I want someone who sees me, not just what I can do." He rose. "I see you." She stepped closer. "You have not tried to touch me once." "I wanted it to be your choice." "It is." He reached for her, slow and certain, and she leaned into him. His arms came around her, strong and warm, steady as the land. Zinnia closed her eyes. She had been cold for so long. Calder whispered against her temple, "You are not alone anymore." And for the first time in weeks, she believed it. Zinnia stood at the washbasin, sleeves rolled and damp, wringing out the cloth she'd used to scrub the kitchen table. The scent of lye soap still clung to her hands. Outside the window, the light was softening, brushing everything in the yard with a golden hush. Calder was mending the fence that ran along the south pasture, hammer striking wood in even, measured beats. She watched him a moment, then turned back to finish drying the table. That evening, he brought in a small bundle wrapped in flour sack cloth. He set it gently on the counter beside her. "I picked up something in town," he said, tugging off his gloves. Zinnia eyed the bundle, cautious. "What for? You'll see." She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a bolt of blue calico, deep indigo scattered with tiny white flowers. Her fingers brushed the fabric's fine weave. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "I know." She looked up. "Why?" Calder pulled out a chair and sat. "You don't have anything that's yours, not really." "I figured it was time you did." Zinnia folded the cloth back over the bolt, pressing her hand flat across it. "I'll make a dress." "I hoped you might." They ate supper with the windows open. The air was warming, just enough to carry the scent of thawing earth. Calder cleared his throat once as he set down his fork. "Preacher's coming out next Sunday. I asked him to bring a license." Zinnia's pulse stumbled. "That soon," he nodded. "No sense waiting. Folks are already talking like we're married. Might as well make it true." She studied him. "You still don't expect anything from it." He met her gaze. "I expect you to live here, work beside me, and tell me when I've done something foolish. I won't ask for more than you're ready to give." He rose then, took their plates, and left her sitting at the table with the weight of his words in the air. That night, she stood in the doorway of her room, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. Calder was in his chair, boots off, eyes half-lidded with the kind of weariness that came from a full day's labor. "Do you miss her?" she asked. His eyes opened fully. "Who? Your sister?" He nodded once. "Every day." Zinnia stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the hearth. "You talk about her like you still carry her with you." "I do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She was better than me, smarter, quieter. She used to say nothing good ever came from rushing toward what you didn't understand. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you too." His voice softened. "She had a way of spotting truth in people." They didn't speak after that. The fire cracked, and the silence between them settled thick and honest. The following morning, Zinnia brought out the sewing tin from the shelf by the pantry. She cleared a space on the table and unrolled the cloth. Calder passed through on his way to the barn, pausing only long enough to glance down. "What's that going to be?" "Wedding dress," she said simply. He nodded once, then stepped out the door. Each day after, she hemmed and stitched between chores. She'd never sewn anything finer than work smocks, but her hands remembered more than she thought they would. The fabric gave beneath her fingers like it knew what it was becoming. 3 days before the preacher was due, Calder came in with a gash across his forearm. "A nail," he said. She washed it with clean water and wrapped it tight. He hissed but didn't pull away. "You should have called me," she said, tying the bandage. "You were working. You're working while bleeding half to death." He let out a quiet breath. "It's just skin." She didn't say anything. Only pressed the last knot snug and stepped back. "Thank you," he said. She folded the cloth she'd used and tucked it beneath the basin. "You do the same for me," he nodded. "I would." On Sunday, the preacher arrived in a wagon with a cracked wheel and a young couple from downriver who'd come to witness. Zinnia stood in the front room in her calico dress, hair pulled back, hands folded at her waist. Calder stood beside her in his best shirt, collar stiff and uncomfortable. The preacher spoke clearly, if a little fast, like he'd done this too many times to make a fuss. When he asked Calder if he would take Zinnia as his wife, Calder didn't hesitate. "Yes." When the same question was asked of her, Zinnia lifted her chin. "I do." The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and the couple from downriver clapped. Calder looked at her then, not with triumph or pride, but with a quiet kind of certainty, like he had known all along it would come to this. Later, after the wagon rolled away and the witnesses were gone, Calder stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. "You can have the front bedroom now," he said. "If you want it." Zinnia stepped beside him. The fields were green with new shoots and the sun was starting to dip behind the far ridge. "I'll stay where I am for now," she said. "But not forever." He didn't press, just nodded. As the evening settled in, Zinnia leaned against the porch rail and looked out across the land. It wasn't hers by blood, nor by inheritance, but something in her chest loosened as she watched it stretch out wide and steady. She had a name again. A place. A man who spoke with action, not promises. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting to be cast aside. The first rain came soft and steady, tapping against the roof shingles like an old friend returned. Zinnia stood barefoot in the doorway, the hem of her calico dress brushing her ankles, watching the drops darken the dust in the yard into rich, living earth. Calder had gone out early to bring the cattle in from the South Bend, where the land dipped low and water ran too fast when the clouds opened. She kept the fire going low and spent the better part of the morning stitching a lining into one of his old coats. The threads were thick and stubborn, and her thumb ached from the needle, but the rhythm steadied her. The house no longer felt borrowed. By the time Calder returned, soaked through and mud to the knees, the sky had begun to clear. He handed her his hat without a word and pulled off his boots by the back door. "You find all of them?" she asked, folding the coat over the back of a chair. "Near enough," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. One calf wandered off, found him tangled in a thistle patch. She brought him a towel without being asked, and he took it with a grateful nod. "I can go check the fence line tomorrow," she offered. "If it's dry enough." "You sure?" "I know what I'm looking for." He looked at her then, the corners of his eyes lined with something that wasn't quite surprise, but close. "You do," he said. They shared warm cornbread and dried apples for supper. She listened as he spoke about the slope behind the barn needing terracing, the way the topsoil kept washing down after each spring. He never raised his voice, never filled the room just to hear himself. His words were measured, like he'd already turned them over in his head before offering them. "You ever think about hiring help?" she asked. He chewed slowly, then shook his head. "Hard to trust men who only stay long enough to ruin your tools and ride off with your whiskey. I'd rather take my time and do it right." Zinnia dipped her bread in the syrup pot. You ever think about teaching someone to stay? He set down his fork and watched her, quiet and still. You offering? I'm saying it wouldn't be the worst thing. That night, she didn't return to the spare room. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. She simply walked past the familiar door and stepped into the room where the fire was already lit, where his boots sat by the hearth and his flannel shirt hung from the peg on the wall. She folded back the covers and lay down. Calder stirred from his chair, crossing to the washstand. He didn't look at her, not directly, but his shoulders eased and his voice was lower when he spoke. You warm enough? Yes. He washed his face and dried it slow, then crossed to the bed and climbed in beside her, careful not to crowd her. The mattress dipped beneath his weight. After a stretch of silence, she turned toward him. I used to think belonging meant being claimed, she said. He didn't answer right away. Then, and now I think it means being chosen. Every day. Even when nobody's watching. He reached for her then, hands sliding over hers, rough palm to rough palm. I choose you, he said. Zinnia let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She shifted closer, her head against his shoulder, the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear. Morning came with the smell of damp pines and the soft hush of fog rolling through the pasture. Calder rose early again, but he didn't leave without brushing his hand across her back, just once, before pulling on his boots. Zinnia lit the stove and started a pot of coffee, humming under her breath. Later, as she walked the fence line, she found the place where the wire had come loose. She knelt and tightened the post with the grip of someone who'd learned to make do, who knew the value of quiet hands and steady work. When she stood, Calder was just coming over the ridge with a coil of rope slung across his shoulder. You missed a spot, he said, pointing to the far corner. She raised an eyebrow. Then why didn't you fix it last week? Wanted to see if you'd catch it. She crossed her arms. You testing me now? No, he said, grinning without teeth. Just admiring the view. Zinnia rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched despite herself. They worked the rest of the morning side by side. He showed her how to brace the posts with stones from the creek, and she showed him how to splice frayed wire with a needle's precision. By midday, the sun had burned off the fog. They sat under a cottonwood, sharing what little bread they'd brought with them. Calder leaned back in the grass, hands behind his head, eyes closed. You ever think you'd end up like this? He asked. Zinnia picked at the crust of the bread, then looked out across the land. No, but I think I was always headed here. I just didn't know what it would look like. He opened one eye. And now, she reached down, brushing a blade of grass from his shirt. Now I do. The wind stirred the branches overhead, and the leaves whispered something low and content. Zinnia leaned back beside him, the warmth of his shoulder against hers. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to by mid-May. The cottonwoods had leafed out fully, their pale green shimmer trembling in the breeze that came down from the hills. Zinnia stood outside the smokehouse, apron stiff with flour dust, holding a bucket of ash to scatter around the garden rows. The seedlings were starting to push through, slender and stubborn, and she'd begun to wake each morning thinking first of what needed tending. Calder had ridden out before sunup to settle a matter with a neighbor over grazing lines. He'd taken the long trail west, where the land rose in ridges and the air smelled of sagebrush and sun-warmed stone. Zinnia didn't expect him back before dusk, and the quiet around the homestead was wide enough to hear the flick of sparrows' wings. She used the time to patch the chicken coop's wire, then walked the slope behind the barn, where she'd noticed the soil drying too fast. She marked the ground with wooden stakes, planning to dig shallow furrows to hold more water when the rains came again. In the afternoon, she sat on the porch steps with a scrap of muslin stretched between her hands, stitching a length of embroidery into the hem of a pillowcase. Her stitches weren't decorative, just a small pattern to mark it as theirs. She'd never had much use for pretty things, but something about the steadiness of the needle soothed her in ways she hadn't expected. By the time she heard hooves on the trail, the sun was beginning to sink low. Calder rode in slower than usual, his posture tighter in the saddle. She rose as he dismounted, her brow furrowed. "You hurt?" "No," he said, looping the reins over the hitching post. "Just irritated." She waited. "Elias Murphy's been running his stock past the boundary line again. Said the markers must have been moved in the last rain." "They weren't," she said. He blew out a breath. "I know." They walked toward the house together, boots soft in the dust. "You going to report him?" Calder shook his head. "Won't do much. The sheriff's his cousin." They stepped inside. Zinnia set water to boil while Calder washed the trail dust from his hands. He didn't speak much over supper, picking at his beans more than eating them. Afterward, she found him in the small back room they used for storing tack and tools. He was sitting on an overturned crate, sharpening a hoof knife with slow, deliberate strokes. She leaned against the doorframe. "You ever think about expanding?" His hand paused. "You mean more land?" "I mean more than just keeping it running. You've got the skill and the stock's healthy. You could add another pasture, maybe even a hand or two if you found the right ones." Calder looked up. "I've thought about it." "Then why haven't you?" He set the knife aside and wiped the blade clean. "Because until recently I didn't see the point." Zinnia stepped into the room. "And now," he met her eyes, "now I do." She didn't smile, but something in her chest warmed. She crossed to the workbench and picked up a coil of twine, unraveling a length slowly between her fingers. "I've been thinking about that north-facing plot behind the barn," she said. "If we built a root cellar, we could keep potatoes through winter without losing half to rot." Calder stood. "We'll need stone, and I'd have to haul some of the old beams up from the creek. I can help. I know." They stood in that small room, the last of the daylight cutting across the floor in long, amber lines. Calder stepped closer, slow but certain. "I've never had someone speak of plans like that with me," he said. "Only ever to me. There's a difference," Zinnia nodded. "I've only ever been expected to listen." He reached out, brushing a curl from her cheek. His hand was warm, calloused, careful. "Have you thought about a family?" he asked. She looked up at him, steady. "I used to think I wasn't meant for one. And now, I think maybe I just hadn't found where I belonged." Calder's breath hitched, almost imperceptible. He cupped her jaw, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I want that with you, not just because it's expected. Because I want it." Zinnia's voice was quiet but firm. "Then we'll build it together." That night he held her with both arms wrapped around her middle, their legs tangled beneath the quilt she'd finished just before the frost broke. The house was still, and outside the window the moon hung low and round over the pasture. She didn't dream of Elijah anymore. Not with ache and not with guilt. Her past hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. By the time summer came, the garden would be full, the cellar dug, the herd strengthened. But none of that felt as full as the way Calder breathed against her shoulder, steady and content, like nothing in the world was missing. Because nothing was. The light filtered softer through the windows now, as if the house itself had settled into something permanent. Zinnia moved through the parlor with calm purpose, dragging the bristle broom in long sweeps across the floorboards. She paused at the hearth where a folded letter sat on the mantel. She hadn't touched it since it arrived, not for lack of curiosity, but because it bore her maiden name in a hand she hadn't seen since she left Arkansas. She picked it up now, slowly unfolding the paper. The writing was tidy, the message brief. Her cousin Ruth had passed, leaving behind a daughter, 7 years old with no living kin nearby. Zinnia read the words twice. She stood still for a long moment, the paper softening under her fingers as the implications settled through her. When Calder came in from the barn, dust on his shoulders and sun baked into his skin, she met him at the door. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, holding out the letter. He read it quietly, brows drawn low. "She's alone?" he asked. "In Fort Smith. The woman who wrote says she's staying with a neighbor, but only for a little while." Zinnia looked down at her hands. "I was the only family Ruth had left. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I married, but she was good to me once." Calder folded the letter and set it carefully on the table. "What are you thinking?" "I think we should go get her." He nodded. "Then we will." They began the journey 2 days later, leaving the ranch in the care of a widower from 3 Pines who owed Calder a favor. The man brought his grown son to help with the herd, and Zinnia packed food, warm bedding, and her strongest boots. The trail east was long and the days stretched quiet. They camped under clear skies, Zinnia resting her head against Calder's shoulder as the fire burned low. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to ask small things: whether she remembered Ruth's laugh, what the child's name was. She answered with stories she hadn't told in years. They reached Fort Smith after 5 days of hard riding. The town was louder than Zinnia remembered, the streets thick with wagon carts and townsfolk rushing between errands. They found the neighbor's house easily a clapboard cottage near the river. A woman in a gingham apron met them at the gate. "She's quiet," the woman said. "Scared mostly. But she doesn't cry much, just watches everything." Zinnia stepped into the parlor and saw the child sitting cross-legged by the window, a rag doll clutched tight to her chest. She had Ruth's eyes wide and steady, with a kind of watchfulness that made her seem older than she was. Zinnia knelt slowly. "Your name is Edie," the girl nodded. "I'm your cousin Zinnia. This is Calder. We've come to take you home if you'd like that." Edie studied them both without speaking, then looked down at the doll. After a long pause, she stood and took Zinnia's hand. The return trip was slower. Edie didn't speak much, but she rode well, holding the reins with care and always watching the horizon. At night, Zinnia and Calder made her a bedroll between theirs, and Calder told her short stories about stubborn cows and skittish mules. Sometimes she'd smile, just a little. By the time they reached the ranch, the hills were green again, and the garden had doubled in size under the neighbor's careful watch. Edie dismounted without help, looked around at the house and said, "It smells like bread." Zinnia took her inside and showed her the small room beside the kitchen. "It was a pantry once," she said. "We'll fix it up, paint the walls, maybe make you a bigger window." Edie touched the sill. "Can it be blue?" Zinnia smiled. "Of course." Over the following weeks, the house shifted to fit 3 instead of 2. Calder built a desk for Edie from leftover barn planks, and Zinnia taught her how to knead dough and read seed packets. Edie asked quiet questions about Ruth, about Arkansas, about whether this place would still be hers if she made a mistake. Zinnia answered every one with calm honesty. One evening, after Edie had gone to bed, Zinnia and Calder sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the pasture. "She's settling," Zinnia said. "I wasn't sure at first, but she's starting to trust it." Calder tipped his head back against the wall. "She's got your backbone." Zinnia let out a breath. "I don't know what kind of mother I'll be." "You already are," he said. "And a damn good one." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind shift through the grass. Zinnia turned to him. "Are you happy?" He met her gaze. "I didn't know what that word meant until you." She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, the warmth of him grounding her. Inside, the house was quiet, its corners filled now with softness books stacked on the kitchen table. A half-finished drawing pinned to the wall, a pair of small boots drying by the stove. They had made a life, not by planning it, but by choosing it again and again, day after day. Through hardship, through stillness, through the long silence of starting over. And now, under the stars that life held, years passed, and the ranch grew with them. The north pasture held a new barn, and the root cellar brimmed each fall with potatoes and preserved beans. Edie grew tall and sure-footed, her laughter loud and unguarded. She called Calder Pa without thinking and braided wildflowers into Zinnia's hair on Sundays. Calder built a swing beneath the cottonwood tree, and Zinnia planted hollyhocks along the fence. They grew in crooked rows, pink and red, careless and bright. One evening, Edie ran through the yard with a wood-handled bucket in her hand, chasing after a lamb that had slipped from the pen. Calder stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching with a grin he didn't bother to hide. Zinnia came to stand beside him, their hands brushing, then clasping. The sky burned gold overhead, and the land lay quiet as if watching them back. Zinnia turned to him, her voice low. "We did all right." Calder squeezed her hand. Better than that. And they stayed there, the three of them, bound not by blood or promise, but by something deeper earned and held quietly, without need for grand words, together. Always.